to the Elliott School of International Affairs. My name is Ambassador Ruben Brigady, and I am the Dean of the Elliott School. It is my honor and my pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening, and especially Dr. Michael Heise, Chief Economist at Allianz SE, and my colleague, the Honorable Mark Kennedy, Director of the Graduate School of Political Management at GW. This evening's event is part of the Institute for International Economic Policy's International Finance Forum Series, and is being co-sponsored by the Economic Club of Minnesota, the GW Graduate School of Political Management, Allianz SC, and the Elliott School's Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. The Elliott School is very pleased to host this event and proud to serve as the convener for this very important discussion on the financial future of the European Union. I have to say, I am not an economist by training, but I have been riveted by the financial issues, particularly surrounding Greece over the last year or so, not only for what it means for the Greek economy, not only it means for the European economy, but frankly what it means for the very idea of Europe. And I think it's fair to say, and I trust that it will be discussed this evening, that the concept of Europe is under challenge as never before. Not since the creation of the European Union. So this is indeed an extremely timely conversation. There is true value in the kind of partnership that an event like this affords, collaborating across campus, across institutes, across sectors, and indeed across continents. It demonstrates the broad expertise that we have here at GW in addressing economic issues through a variety of perspectives. So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Graciela Kaminski, Professor of Economics and International Affairs at the Elliott School and Research Associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Dr. Kaminski will share more details about the International Finance Forum and also about tonight's speaker. Without further ado, Dr. Kaminski.
So, good afternoon to all of you. I'm one of the coordinators of the International Finance Forum series, together with Professor Jay Schambach, that now is on loan to the Council of Economic Advisors. I would say that he will say exactly the same as I say today, that we are very excited that Dr. Michael Heise is here with us to talk about the future of the European Monetary Union. A topic is of great importance right now in the midst, not just of a crisis in the Eurozone, but crisis in the emerging markets around the world, in Asia, Latin America, now Africa too. So this is a very important topic that we're going to deal in the next future months. I would like to say that the topic that Dr. Heise is going to talk about is very dear to the core of our International Finance Forum series. In the past, we have invited both academics and people in policy circles to talk about various issues such as currency crisis, that I guess that we have managed to have many of those, sovereign debt crisis, banking problems, and booms and busts in international capital flows, and prices of stocks and bonds around the world. Dr. Heise joins a very prestigious group of colleagues that have presented seminars here. Among them, Professor Maurice Oswald, at that time professor at Berkeley University, now the chief economist at the IMF. Dr. Olivier Blanchard, the previous chief economist at the IMF. Professor Charles Engel at Wisconsin, from Wisconsin University. Dr. Hyun Song Shin, that at that time was professor at Princeton and now is the head of research of the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland. So we are very happy to have Dr. Heise today with us. The topic of his presentation is also going to be be very dear to us, because the research in the international group here at George Washington University is basically on these topics. From exchange rate regimes, what happens when you have a float, what happens when you have a fixed exchange rate regime, what happens after you have a bonanza in international capital flows. Do bonanzas end well, or do bonanzas end all in crisis? So this is the research that both Jay, Shambak, and myself have been working on, not alone, but also with a large group of graduate students. So I think that this is going to be very important for us. I'm looking forward to today's presentation. Without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Michael Heise. He's the chief economist of Allianz SE. He has been also the Secretary General of the German Council of Economic Experts, chief economist of the DG Bank, and chief economist and head of research at the DC Bank. I'm also going to introduce Professor Mark Kennedy. He's one of us. He's a professor at GW and the director of the Graduate School of Political Management. And he's going to coordinate with the presentations he's going to introduce, Dr. Heise, and is going to moderate the question and answer part of his presentation. So without further ado, let me introduce both of them. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
So you want me to start, yes?
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here in this impressive surrounding of the Institute. The title of my talk is difficult. It's Drifting Apart Despite Economic Recovery, the European Union, drifting apart despite economic recovery. This, of course, refers to the political disaccord we have, the tensions we have, the nationalistic tendencies we have in the EU. And I would like to address these more political issues in the first couple of minutes, and then move on to talk a little bit about the European economy, the present state of the European economy and where it might be going. And I guess many issues we can dig deeper into after my brief talk. So I think it is very justified to say that 2016 will be a very critical and decisive year for the European Union. If it meets the challenges and manages the challenges that it faces, it might come out of this crisis stronger, but there is a risk that actually we do drift apart, as the title says. There's a couple of forces which are causing this drifting apart, some centrifugal forces. The biggest one is, of course, the immigration issue, the mass immigration of refugees, especially in Germany. Countries have very different immigration policies, and the societies in the different countries in Europe have different acceptance of this migration, and that causes a lot of tension, a lot of conflict, and actually has also caused the the reappearance of border controls, for example, between Germany and Austria. There's no free movement of labor as we had it, people for years and years. There's again border controls, not only there in many places in Europe. They have suspended the so-called Schengen Agreement, which is the completely free movement of labor within the countries that have signed this. It has been suspended. It's still in force, but as an exception for some time, there are border controls. That's one issue that is creating tensions in Europe. The other one is still the issue around fiscal policies, what we like to call austerity. Although you can't really see austerity in the numbers. If you look at the public debt to GDP figures, they're rising and rising and rising all over, except in Germany, by the way. So it's not really a situation you would talk about austerity, but still there's this how do you say, controversy between especially some southern countries and the northern countries. You have a lot of anti-capitalist, anti-austerity parties and political forces in countries like Spain, Podemos. In Portugal, you have a left government. In Greece, you all know that. We had, of course, the rise of Tsipras and Syriza, who were criticizing the austerity demands by the EU and the Troika. So there is still this conflict going on. The third thing that will be important this year is, of course, the decision of the British people whether they want to stay in the EU or whether they want to leave it. I hope that an exit can be avoided. It, in my view, doesn't give any advantages to Great Britain, but we will see. It's a very close call. If Great Britain exits the EU, this will be another weakening of the community, both internally as well as externally. So these are the issues, and they are quite serious, and they go they are rather profound, because all of these issues in a way involve what we call the common basic values that the EU is built on. We have these basic values that are like a common denominator for a very, very heterogeneous group of countries. But they all are supposed to adhere to certain basic values that have been laid down in the Treaty of the European Union. And all these things that I mentioned have come into conflict with some of these basic rules. From a German point of view, many people in Germany are opposing the fact that the right of law has been breached in many occasions in Europe in the last couple of years. Maastricht Treaty, the rules for fiscal policy, they were not really respected before the crisis. When you remember the thresholds for debt and deficits and so on were actually not binding for many countries. They just didn't pay respect for them. And these rules, these legal rules were also breached after the crisis, when the no bailout clause, which is in the treaties, was actually overridden, and countries were bailed out, in contrast to what the treaty would have said. So some journalists, for example, in Germany have written, or a journalist has written for Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, the sentence, Maastricht, Schengen, and Dublin are the innocent names of 3 cities that symbolize the failure of law in Europe. So that is a German position, that some of these rules have just been, disregarded completely. Other countries see it differently. In southern countries, people would argue that the solidarity, there's been a lack of solidarity in the European Union, and that democratic rights of some of the countries have been how would you say, not really respected, because the Troika, the EU, the IMF, and the ECB have made countries or have given loans to countries, bailout loans, only under conditions that certain reforms be enacted, and that is often seen as a interference into the democratic and sovereign rights of these countries. So there are very different positions on this. The question is, what's the way out? How will this play out? I can only give a few very general conclusions on this. I think we in Europe, we need to acknowledge the fact that countries are very different, have different traditions, different cultures, different priorities, maybe even priorities concerning the basic rights that I was talking about. We have to acknowledge that, but we should also not forget that the EU, over the decades, has been very, very successful in safeguarding some common values in this group of countries. Actually, the foundation of the EU in the 50s was basically a move to safeguard to preserve some of these values that had completely disappeared in the World War, of course, to bring countries together on the basis of common values and thereby to secure peace. And that actually has been quite successful. Also, the enlargement of the EU with the Eastern countries was basically a move by these countries to safeguard the freedoms, the democratic rights they had fought for in their revolutions, and to safeguard them in a group of countries that has similar values. So I think we should always remember that. There are, of course, always situations or phases when national interests dominate. We presently have that with Poland, where there's a discussion they want to change the constitution and some laws, which is not to the liking of many other European countries. So what happens is we have a discussion, and that's how it should be. If a country is interfering or contradicting these basic values, freedom of press, of freedom of parliament, and so on, then there's a discussion in Europe, and I think that is the way it has to be. In the end, Poland will not move out of the EU. I'm pretty sure about that. The second point is we should probably not be too ambitious concerning the goal of European integration. The ever closer integration is something, for example, Great Britain has opted out. That is not the goal. That is not where they want to go. We should maybe use the picture of variable geometry, where we have different clubs in Europe and different forms of integration. For example, we have the Euro, where Great Britain is not going to be part of for many, many years. We have the Schengen area, which is again a completely different club of countries who have agreed to free movement of people. We have the banking union, where non-Euro members can join. Great Britain is probably not going to join that, even if it's out of Euro. So we will have different clubs, which makes management difficult. That is not easy, but it's a fact of reality. And I think we have to be a little less ambitious in terms of the integration. Third point I would make is that we have to make progress in foreign policies, in common European foreign policies and security policies, and to demonstrate to the people the EU is not only about economics and financial stuff, it's also about foreign security policies. It's also supposed to protect against threats from the outside and from the inside. And this is eminently important, and this would probably create a better sentiment towards the European Union. The fourth point is, of course, that we need to find practical solutions to the refugee problem, which is a very heated up discussion. I won't go into it here. If you like, we can discuss the situation in Germany on that in the panel. So these are some of the general conclusions I would draw. For getting some momentum back into European integration, we need, of course, an improvement of the economic situation. I think that is very clear that people become very dissatisfied with the European Union if there's no economic progress, if there's high unemployment, pressure on wages, and the like, things we've seen in recent years. That is clear that this leads to disaccord of the people with the EU. So we need economic prosperity. And I don't want to go into it too deep. I think this is where I have a little bit of good news for you after mentioning all these problems. The European Union is recovering economically. There are a couple of forces which are driving the economy. Let me just mention very briefly. It's oil, cheap oil, which is really enhancing purchasing power, which is making real wages surge and which is feeding into consumption. Then we have the euro, which is a weak euro, which gives a strong tailwind to exporters in the Eurozone, despite the fact that the world markets are rather slow presently. Then we've had That's the third factor. Quite a few reforms and I would say macroeconomic adjustments in the last couple of years in those countries that, well, had their crises, that had surging unemployment. We've seen major adjustments take place in terms of wages. The current account deficits have basically been eliminated. Fiscal deficits have been reduced at least. Unemployment is finally going down. Employment is rising. In many of these countries, even in Greece, which is lagging behind very much, but you can see it strongly in countries like Spain or Portugal, not to speak of Ireland. They had, I think, 6.8% growth last year, and will have probably another 5% this year, so it's a boomtown again, Celtic tiger in Ireland. But this has helped. In the meantime, also the big countries, Italy and France, have embarked on a process of reform. It's been very slow and very lagged, but in the meantime, policymakers there are also enacting reforms. Italy was, by the way, ahead of France in embarking on reforms. We can also discuss that if you like, but that's helping these economies to recover as well. Germany, very last word, is in a fairly positive cyclical situation presently. We have growing employment, about 1% employment growth. We have wages growing between 2.5% and 3%. And this leads to strong growth of real disposable income in Germany because we have basically flat prices. Prices are stable, so nominal growth of wages is equal to real growth of wages, and we have 2.7% presumably real disposable income growth, and that feeds into consumption. Consumption is growing very, very strong, whereas exports and investment are still rather weak, or they've gotten weaker in the recent months once again, because we have this very soft patch in the global economy. But consumption is very reliable. So I think that we will have a strong year in Germany. So let me finish here by maybe just saying that it can be hoped that the economic improvements that we are seeing and that will continue in 2016 will hopefully take a little bit of wind out of the sails of the populist parties and powers in Germany that we've seen pop up in almost all countries. It's Le Pen in France, the Front National, it's Alternative für Deutschland, AfD in Germany, it's of course UKIP in Great Britain, and it's the Peace in Poland, and you could go on and on and on. Populist parties. I hope that the recovery of the economy will take a little wind out of their sails. So let me stop with that, and now we can.
It's focused on. I had the opportunity to study at the Universiteit Interfaculteit Bedrijfskunde in Delft, the Netherlands, when I was as young as these students. And I remember there was a bunch of students saying, we're going to get together, we Europeans are going to get together, and we're going to be bigger and stronger than America. And all the professors were just snickering, saying, there's still a lot of divisions left between the different countries, as we're seeing break out now. On a recent trip, we had some people saying, those of our age understood how important this is for peace. That we haven't fought any wars since the European Union came together. But people that are younger have forgotten about that. We now have these common borders and this trading, but they've sort of taken that for granted, that there's something new that has to come to capture the imagination of the younger generation. Is there ideas as to what can be done besides this nascent growth that you're talking about that can capture the imagination of the young to have them feel more European and less French or German or Italian?
Economic prosperity is a necessary condition for regaining some momentum of European integration, for making people not euphoric, but more positive with respect to European integration. There is no euphoria anymore. I don't know when you were at the university in the Netherlands, but
1982.
Okay.
Before a lot of these folks were born.
Yeah, okay. That's not true. But But, okay, that was the time of the common market,
Yeah.
when, you know, there was a little bit breaking up mood in Europe. And you're completely right. In the meantime, this has faltered. Younger people are not aware of Europe 50, 60 years ago. They take it for granted that we have peace. They take it in a way for granted that the borders are open, you don't need to show your passport and you just go. And so we need a new vision. You're completely right. Possibly the crisis we see now, could create such a new vision. If people see, and also especially younger people, the disaccord that we have presently, and the fights over these issues with immigration, and that it is very consequential. If Europe closes its borders, then people die in the Mediterranean Sea. So there's a lot of emotion in this debate, and I could imagine that especially the younger Europeans say we have to come together on this issue, and there has to be a European solution in a way. It can't be that one country blocks off and the other lets in, and then you have to close the borders internally. That is no solution, and it's a catastrophe that there is no common view on it. So maybe this will actually trigger, in a way, vision is a big word, but a perspective that the EU must have common policies in terms of immigration, in terms of foreign policies, and try to get things under control in Syria and with Turkey and all these issues, to speak with one voice in these issues, and that's very important next to the economic stuff.
So if the borders start getting blocked, and you're sort of blocked economically within your own country, that would presumably have economic consequences for the young people. They perhaps could have less job opportunities or less robust, so it could come back and help them, remind them of the achievement and the necessary to keep them moving forward.
It's a strong symbol if you have to wait at the border for an hour until you can pass by, and you're checked, and the lorries and stuff are waiting, and this creates economic costs. But it's even stronger as a symbol, I think, that people say this can't be the solution. And for young people, it is it's an impediment. It doesn't hinder them from taking a job in a German in France or an Italian in Spain. It still is liberal, and you can move anywhere, but it becomes more difficult.
So some people say that a big problem that sparked the euro crisis is the fact that people had a common currency, but as you were talking about Maastricht, they didn't have a common economic policy or discipline, a fiscal policy, that one country was loose, the other country was tight, and that these disparities amongst the countries within a common currency was a big part of what propelled the problem we had with the euro not too long ago. And a lot of folks are saying that within those that are in the euro, they need to come together with a tighter coordination as to those economic policies. Do you see that happening? Is that viewed as necessary, and will it become reality?
Very good point. I think the first 10 years of the euro were years of strong growth, actually, and but big policy mistakes were made by many countries in these years, these first years of the euro. There was no acquaintance with how do you say, the mechanisms of economic policy in the currency union. Countries that entered the currency union were used to devaluing, to setting their own interest rates. All this was gone. So interest rates went down for these countries because they borrowed, if you like, the credibility of the stable core of the Eurozone, and they had a boom, and they just let it go. They created huge current account deficits. Like Spain was the second biggest deficit country, right behind the United States of America and the whole world. Corporate debt just soared. Wages ran off much faster than productivity. Everything looked okay because the real interest rates had gone down and triggered so much, debt accumulation and things, and they just let it go. And that was not sustainable. And I think countries will have learned the lesson at least for a couple of years, because it was very, very painful. What happened, for example, in Spain, with unemployment then after the bubble burst going up to 25% or something. So I think there's some learning effect by this crisis. But we cannot rely on that. We have to see that in future economic policy behaves more coherent in a currency union. This is presently being done by lots of new rules, basically, which you can be doubtful whether they will really change the game. We have now rules not only for fiscal deficits, excessive fiscal deficits, but also for excessive macroeconomic imbalances. That's a so-called macroeconomic imbalance procedure. Because it wasn't only fiscal deficits that created the crisis, it was the current account deficits, it was lack of competitiveness because of excessive wage increases and lots of stuff. So now the focus is more on macro issues, rightly so, but you can be doubtful whether these new rules will suffice to make countries really pursue very stable economic policies. So the end of the story, in my view, is we need more integration. We can't rely just on these rules. In the long term, we need more integration. We need, as I would say, fiscal authority. Some say treasury in Europe that can actually influence countries that are not behaving, in the interest of the community, but doing what's in their own best interest, not minding the repercussions on others. So we need some kind of an authority, but it's going to take a long time till we get that. Presently, there is absolutely no willingness of any government in the EMU to shed sovereignty to some kind of an EU treasury. That just doesn't fit into the political situation where there's so much criticism of the EU and the monetary union that politicians, won't take this up presently. So we'll have to wait, but it has to come someday.
I recently led a group of students to study Brussels that came from our school as well as the University of Navarra in Spain. And the Spanish students were saying, everything's gotten so big here in Brussels, it shouldn't be so big. And I said, are you sure it's not too big in Madrid, now that more is happening in Brussels? Is Spain United States equivalent, or is it Florida equivalent? The question you ask. And I mean, those are the real nub of the issue going on this economic merger of countries that are within the Eurozone itself. And you're saying that doesn't going to happen, but do we have much confidence that we're not going to have another crisis, where they're not having the countries within the Eurozone move off with different economic policies that are at variance with one another that could lead to another very difficult, challenging period?
It certainly could. I mean, we of course have a huge political risk as well, that countries vote for governments that, again, want to go in a different route than the one you basically have to follow in a currency union, where you don't have sovereignty over very important instruments like the exchange rate so you have to be disciplined in such a currency union. That was basically also the hope, by the way, of the economists. Many economists that were pro-euro before it was introduced, that there would be more disciplining power. If, like wage behavior is excessive, this would be punished immediately by higher unemployment if you can't devalue your currency. That didn't happen because the interest rates went down so strongly and a debt boom developed, as I mentioned just a minute ago, that overcovered all these wrong developments in the economy. So the disciplining effect wasn't there, but I wouldn't draw the conclusion that we are close to another divergence of economic policies. And presently, there's still cleaning up to be done. And in all the countries that were basically cut off capital markets, policymakers are still pressured to do reforms. Even in Greece, as you know, Tsipras did a 180-degree turn and is now pushing for reforms because he finally understood it cost the country, the learning process cost the country a lot of income and a lot of jobs. But finally he's learned that you can't have your deficit as you like it if you have no one who lends you the money. And the capital markets didn't lend the money anymore. And other countries are not willing to lend money that is not, doesn't really improve the growth of the economy. So there's a learning process in all countries, but you could question how long will it last? Will it, governments change and perspectives change, and so yes, it can run into another crisis, but not in the next couple of years.
One would think that as soon as the pressures abate, that there should be a big push during the time when you don't have a crisis to try to solve some of these, one would hope. But the Brexit threat, the British folks, there's a reason why probably the capital markets gravitated to London, because they had less regulations, and they felt that Brussels was passing regulations that were being imposed on London that they had very little say in, or certainly not a veto over. But if you were trying to make an economic argument to Britain why they ought to stay in the European Union, why they ought not to vote to exit, what would be the one or two biggest sort of tangible economic points that you would want the British to understand as they consider whether or not to exit?
Well, I would argue that Great Britain has had no disadvantages economically from being a member of the European Union, but it has had advantages of access to a huge market. And this point is made today by Martin Wolf, who usually don't agree with his monetary policy conclusions, but today I think it's a very good article where he makes his point and says, please tell me, where has growth been impeded or slowed down because of regulations from the EU? And he doesn't find that. And actually the development of the British economy has been fairly strong after the financial shocks and so on, which of course hit Britain very heavily, but it's been a very good development, and you can't really see where is this over-regulation harming the British economy. It's not clear. And if they move out, they will have to accept all the standards of the European common market because they want to cater to it, but they won't have any more say in how these regulations are formed. So that doesn't make sense. You just lose your political voice, but you still have to comply with all the regulations. So that is, to me, the basic argument, and my presumption is that the British they like to debate very intensively. They are doing that, but in the end, I think they will decide to stay in. It does depend a lot on who shows up on the ballots. I've heard that the older people are more clearly in favor of exiting versus the younger people, and the older people go to the polls, the younger people don't. We have statistics on that. There's a big delta. So there are some risks involved, but I think in the end they will decide to stay.
So this is going to be my last question, so we'll take one or two from the audience after this. We've gotten this far without talking about TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Are we giving up on that since we haven't mentioned it? Is it going to be too difficult in this populist environment? Does it not create great opportunities for both our countries? What's the view on TTIP?
I say slow down, that the impetus is in a way gone even. There will be some agreement in my view. There will be a minimal type of agreement. We missed a huge chance, I think, with TTIP. It's more than just reducing trade barriers or regulatory barriers. I think it's, in my view, it could have been something like creating a common market as we have in Europe, transatlantic. And you can imagine the competitive impact that has, the increasing competition, the innovative impact such a common market could have. We saw that in Europe when we opened the markets for competition, how dynamic that was. And you can't calculate that in static economic return thinking or methods. I think it could have been a very dynamic thing, and maybe we would be surprised to the positive about that.
It's got to be very frustrating as an economist. You see this economic angst causing populism to push against policies that you know will help to solve the issues of the economic angst, and yet they're against it. But without further ado, let's go to a question here.
Well, thank you so much for your interesting and thoughtful
We have
presentation.
a mic, I guess, right here. If you could identify yourself, please.
Abraham, I'm a retired Foreign Service. Thank you so much for your interesting and thoughtful presentation. Could you please comment on the current turmoil in the Western European banking system? They mentioned Deutsche Bank and Credit Suisse, for example. The media attributes that to large energy loan losses, to forced liquidation by sovereign country funds, and to inadequate reforms. Could you please comment on the European Union banking system?
Yeah, it is a very difficult problem. It's a scary issue, actually. I think in some countries, we are still seeing the fallout of the big crisis. That doesn't really apply to Germany because we didn't have that big a crisis. But in many European countries, also in Italy, there is the issue of non-performing loans, which is hitting the banks now. Especially UniCredit has declined, I think, by 45% the stock since the beginning of the year. Deutsche Bank is not much better with 35%. So I think this non-performing loan issue is one which is, still hasn't been addressed, and it was subdued somehow by the regulators of the banks. So it's popping up now. The other point is, of course, the energy investments. I don't have full transparency of which bank is how strongly involved. Deutsche Bank says it's not that heavily involved, but the French banks are heavily involved, and it will show up. This is of course another risk, but basically, what I see also some policy responsibility in this whole thing. What has happened in recent years is that the regulators have turned on the screws and have made banks reduce their balance sheets massively, reduce risks, stop risky lending, to do all that to improve their capital situation. At the same time, the ECB has been trying to force banks to generate some lending to the corporate sector by zero interest rates, in the meantime by negative interest rates. So banks are punished if they keep their liquidity with the ECB, and the ECB hopes to force them out into the market with that. But this negative interest rate or zero interest rate, of course, reduces massively the margins of the banks. So their profits have been rather weak. Capital requirements very high, profits very low, and that gets you into this turmoil. So I think there were some policy mistakes being done. The U.S. banking resolution was much tougher and maybe more consequential. You just recapitalized many banks, and then they could go again. Got rid of the non-performing assets, and then you go again. This has been very delayed in Europe, and I think that's the basic reason.
Thank you.
Other questions? We have a question over here.
There's a new pipeline.
There should be a mic coming your way. If you could just please identify yourself and then ask the question.
Larry Broadwell, I'm an alumnus of the Elliott School.
No, go ahead and ask your question.
Okay. There's a new pipeline coming on stream soon from Russia. Oil is coming to Germany. And I'm wondering what your assessment of the impact is on European solidarity vis-a-vis Russia, on stability of the oil market and the European economy.
Yeah, well, that's another controversial issue, of course, in Europe, and some countries feel side-passed by this new pipeline. But I think it is, in the interest of energy security in Germany. Given the state of affairs, we don't have a common energy policy, where the European Union settles contracts with the suppliers of oil or gas for the European Union as a whole. Maybe that's where it should go, but that's not the present situation. Every country is doing its own business with the energy suppliers, and I think here Germany is needs to safeguard these supplies. And actually, some supplies are flowing back to the east into Ukraine because there's the supply from Russia to Ukraine has been interrupted many times. And so it's going the other way around now. So that's at least one positive aspect of that. But it is a controversial issue. But Germany is in its energy policies very, very ad hoc, with little strategic planning. We moved out of nuclear after Fukushima in a very quick decision by our chancellor. And then we started subsidizing renewables very heavily, which is very costly for the energy, the electricity consumer. Then we didn't have the infrastructure in place to move the wind energy from north to south and solar energy from A to B. So we needed a basic reserve in electricity production, and that is coal, which is not climate friendly. So the impact on CO2 isn't really there of all these moves. So there's a lot of things to clear up in German energy policies. But I think the independence from pass-through states, I think, is at least one positive aspect.
Question in the back here?
Preston Feinberg from Williams & Johnston law firm. I have a question, if you could talk about BEPS and what are the different policies? We see a lot of the money going into Ireland, and what are the different various policies among countries as to taking in these money so multinationals can avoid paying taxes in their original country?
Oh yeah, well that's a question I'm not very deeply into. It's really something for the accountants and lawyers and tax experts. But I think the relocation of profits between countries has to be kept at bay in a certain way. I think that is an issue of fairness, and it's also a contentious issue by the U.S. government that companies move their profits to elsewhere where the corporate tax rate is a lot lower than in the United States. So I think that we need to come to some international agreements on that, and it'll be difficult because we cannot harmonize tax rates globally. Not even in Europe we can do that. But I think we have to find some common agreement, some common denominator.
We could have 2 or 3 other seminars on that issue. One of them being that America is the only country that taxes overseas earnings, really, a big industrialized country, which creates a disparity. One, the OECD is looking at exactly this issue, which would be another great topic to talk about. But I don't know that we've got the time to address them all there. Do we have time for one more question? We'll have one more question right here, and then we're probably running up against our time.
Maybe you take both and then
We'll
just...
take 2 more, so we'll take these 2 we had over here, and then we'll be done. So we'll come right here to Olga.
Good evening, my name is Olga. I was core fellow and PhD student at Tomsk State University, Russia. So my question is about circular economy. As we know that the world's population and economy growth and the current economy model is not available, and we should think about circular economy. Tomorrow will be a seminar about boosting the circular economy, which is organized the Embassy of the Netherlands. So, and as the Netherlands is considered like the top country in this question, so my demand is, are there some EU regulations already which have been established regarding the circular economy, or there are some starting talks how the new regulation on circular economy could be established? Thank you.
Okay, circular economy refers to the use of resources
Yep.
and the climate friendly production processes, yeah. I think, yes, I would say it's a big issue, yes. There are, I think, quite a few initiatives by EU policymakers to go in that direction. And it is also something that is quite in the, how do you say, on trend with the big corporations. I'm not sure if I'm interpreting circular economy in the correct way. Let me talk about the climate friendly production in Europe. That is actually taking shape. My own company caused quite some media, how do you say, stir when we announced that we would disinvest in carbon technologies. And that is something which has been not copied, but which has incentivized many others to think about that as well, to reduce your investment in coal, in all CO2 and carbon fuels. That is one way of stimulating that, and I think it is a trend. And we have to be front runners a little bit on that, because I mean, we don't have really a growing population. You mentioned the population growth and the consumption of raw materials, of environmental resources and so on, which is not really in Russia, and it's not in Europe. But we still have to be front runners to maybe give a good example also for other regions that are growing massively in terms of population. So I think it's an immensely important thing. And we had the Paris, of course, the Paris Agreement, which was somewhat surprising, was very positively taken by the global institutions. We'll now have to see how the countries really come up to their promises. That is still always to be seen with a question mark. But I think the trend is clear, and yeah, we need to go that way.
All right, our last question, right over, was it you, sir?
I was curious, despite the debt, the refugee crisis, and the Brexit, there's still a lot of countries that are very much interested in going into the EU, especially in Southeastern Europe, but with Bosnia, Montenegro, Albania, a couple of them are actually candidates. What's the mood amongst businessmen and EU politicians on the prospect of allowing new members in when it comes to all the issues that are currently at hand? Yeah.
Well, I think to say, to start with that, there's a positive mood of the business community with respect to migration, to the inflow of people in general. Not in an uncontrolled process as we have at times had it in Germany. It has been almost uncontrolled. We had an influx of 1.1 million people registered in Germany in last year, in 2015. Some may have moved on, but there may also be a large number of people who haven't even been registered. They're somehow in the country, and we don't exactly know where and how. So this was, an overwhelming our immigration system. It was not suited to cope with these masses of people coming. So there's a lot of criticism also from the corporate sector that the management of this whole process has to be, solid. From countries of Southeast Europe, there is a lot of migration also. People can come to us from non-EU countries as well if they have found a job. And there's this regulation that there's no German who would, be able to or willing to take this type of job. So this type of migration is also seen positively by the corporates. We do have not a lack of labor, but less qualified jobs. They need to be filled, and also the highly qualified jobs. So there's a lot of specific areas where we need people, and we're positive on that. But, you know, I can't talk for the corporate sector as a whole, but taking in now countries like Serbia, Bosnia, and so on into the EU, I think would find pretty stark resistance presently by most CEOs of the corporate sector, because we are still fighting for the integration and for the convergence of the countries like Romania and Bulgaria that have entered the EU, which are on such a low level in terms of development and incomes that it is, you know, creating massive tensions. And to, you know, enlarge the group of these poor countries in the present situation would not really help. It would be better to let in the people that don't find jobs in these countries, to have a managed process how they can find jobs, not only in Germany, but in the EU as a whole. That seems sensible. But integrating them is going to be dangerous, and that's one of the main issues the Brits have actually with the EU, that they are forced to treat people that come from other EU countries exactly the same way they treat their own population. So if someone comes from Bulgaria, gets a really low-paid job in the UK, he will get the same social benefits as if he was a British person. And this is the inward benefits that David Cameron has been fighting against. And actually, he's reached a compromise because other countries have the same issue. We in Germany also, you know, have big payouts, and other countries as well, because people come for reaping the social benefits. And if you include even more countries in Southeast Europe that are so low in their development stage, that would aggravate the problem.
Well, we appreciate all your insights. I don't think America has a more important ally and friend than Europe. Your challenges are a concern to us, and we appreciate the wonderful job you did explaining those all. So please give our guests one more round of applause.